And so I called her in and asked her, where did you get this article? Like, she's like, oh, I got it in the library, which is impossible because we don't have access to it, and I wish that we did. And she didn't, at the end of it, I asked her straight up what the function argument was, and she had no idea. So if you're gonna cheat, just be better at it. That's, take a page out of Thrasymachus' book, right? Get good at it. You guys ready? Cool. Initial thoughts in an official way.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Is this the whole book?
Is what the whole book?
The Republic? Like, did some, maybe get erased over the thousands of years?
No, this is it. This is what we got. As far as we know, this is the whole book, and there have been multiple copies found in ancient Greek, so we know. So if you look, I know you don't have this. So in this is the complete text of all of Plato. It lists all the dialogues, and then there are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like a dozen or so that have been attributed to Plato, but most scholars are like, it's probably not the case that Plato wrote this, because there's linguistic problems, changes in writing. The arguments aren't quite as good as they should be. So it's probably someone who maybe came from Plato's school. Over time, people thought it was Plato. But this, definitely, we know that this is the whole book. What's weird is it seems like it ends after book 9. Like it's a complete argument. And then book 10 comes up, because in book 3 and 4, he's talking about education. Book 3, he's talking about art and the problems of art and poetry and things like this. And then they don't really talk about it again. And then all of a sudden in book 10, he goes, let's talk about poetry again and the problems of art. And it's this radically different argument that's way more complex, and it just doesn't seem like it fits. It seems like it's already done. So some people think like Plato may have tacked that on later at the end. But as far as is this the whole Republic? Yes, this is completely it. Why do you ask?
I was just wondering.
Oh, okay. All right, so any other favorite parts aside from what Logan said? Were you guys able to read the whole thing? Book 1? Most of it at least? Okay. Yeah.
So I know it was talking about justice, and that was the main thing they were trying to get at the root at. But I feel like it highlighted injustice more than justice within the dialogue.
Yes.
Particularly whenever it was talking about somewhere towards the middle end, they said that injustice is unlearned. But I thought that was really ironic because they had spent the whole front half, the whole dialogue learning about how they don't know about justice. So if injustice is unlearned, doesn't that mean justice is just as unlearned?
So, the way of looking at it would be something like injustice for Plato, and through Socrates, the only reason that we would do anything that is damaging to ourselves or commit a vice of any kind, harming ourselves, would be out of ignorance, right? And so we go back to what we know about Parmenides and the way that he talks about language and knowledge. Justice is about things that are the case. It's true, right? So an injustice would just be a lack of that, right? You're operating in something you wouldn't really learn injustice because for him, justice is what is, and injustice is just farther and farther and farther away from that, right? So it wouldn't be something you would learn because what it is you didn't learn justice, and that's the only reason that you're doing the things that you're doing. Right? So, to look at it a different way, if I don't know, I think I maybe use an example, but it's a good one. If you had never heard, if you have never heard of a computer before, ever, you never saw a photograph, no one ever told you about it, and you walked up to one, how well do you think you could use it?
Not well.
Right? You ever see videos of little kids being handed video games from the 80s? So there's this great video on YouTube where 7-year-olds who obviously are playing video games all day long, they hand them the original 8-bit Nintendo, which is what I grew up with, and the cartridges, and they're they can't even figure out how to put it in and turn it on, let alone play the game. And then the best part of it is it's so simple, and that's their argument. I was oh man, when I was a kid, that was awesome. So the idea is the more we know about something, the better we're able to use it. So for Thrasymachus, in this case, it's obvious that he doesn't truly understand what justice is. And it's because of that lack of understanding that he promotes the vision of justice or the version of justice that he does, right? He doesn't see the value in justice, and that's why he seems to be condemning it, right? Good question, though. All right, so some background on this. Plato's Republic is probably his most famous work. It is a treatise that sits squarely in what's called Plato's middle period. So Plato has 3 different periods. His dialogues are divided up accordingly. The early period is known, all the dialogues there are known as Socratic dialogues. What this means is, it seems like Plato is pretty fairly representing what Socrates was actually like. So if you read these early dialogues like the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Law Case, the Lysis, in those dialogues you have Socrates, and he's talking to people, and they always have a very specific topic that they're talking about. So like, what is friendship? Or what is piety? Or what is courage? And in the process, right, just like he does here, he will ask someone who claims to know what, say, courage is. They say they know it. They give their definition. He tears that down. They revise that definition. He tears that down. And then the dialogue ends in a state of aporia, which is Greek. It just means like a state of confusion, where we have sort of suspended judgment. We've given up our convictions because we are no longer certain that we're right. And it's at that moment that Plato thinks learning can actually happen, right? Because we're not going into these arguments with what we believe to be the right answers. We're going into these debates with a genuine, sincere interest in determining the truth, right? This is what is known as dialogue. So, I don't know how long you guys have been involved with philosophy, but I'm sure you've been in classes where you might say something in one of your philosophy classes, and then someone else chimes in and says like, well, that's wrong, and let me tell you why it's wrong. And they say it with this sort of condescending air. Have you guys experienced something like this before? I mean, obviously no Georgia Southern student would ever do something like that. But at other schools, definitely. Anyone who does that, according to Plato, anyone who comes into what is or could be a genuine philosophical dialogue, a genuine philosophical conversation with our eye focused on obtaining some kind of truth or knowledge. Anyone who comes into that with the expressed goal of tearing down anything you say just to win, that is not philosophy. That is what Plato calls eristic or combative arguments. These are the sort of people who care not about the truth at all. The only thing they care about is glory and honor. They just want to win. They want to make themselves look smarter than everybody else. They want the prestige. They want the sort of respect. And they think this is how you get it. Socrates is categorically against this sort of thing, right? He considers these people like warriors fighting a war that they don't need to fight, basically. And when you do this, when you come in and you act that way, so a lot of times what will happen is you'll present an idea, and then someone will like pick apart like the tiniest little thing in that idea, right? And they'll try to just destroy you or like shut you down. That there's no genuine, sincere interest in the truth there. So instead, what Plato wants and what we see here are people that are getting involved in actual dialogue, which means we come to the table to discuss, and we can have different points of view. But the point of us talking and discussing is to actually build something together, right? We both want to get here. So we need to sort of get rid of all of our preconceived notions. We want to get rid of as many biases as we can, or at least recognize that our biases are unfounded. And then once we get there, then we can actually engage in honest dialogue with one another. So if you ever have the compulsion to shut someone down, right? And say like, no, that's wrong. Let me like pick this apart really like mean-like. That sucks and that hurts, but just know that that person's not a philosopher. So, according to Plato, right? I go to so many professional philosophy conferences, and that's pretty much what everybody does the entire time. And it's really annoying. But that's it. When we get to Plato's middle period, there's a change. Socrates is still the main character, but now all of a sudden, well, he still does the Socratic method, right? So the Socratic method, as I think I mentioned last time, Socratic method is just Socrates wanting to know the answer to a question because he genuinely wants to know the truth. he finds an expert, and he just asks question after question after question to try to, it's like either A, get rid of or expel their false beliefs, or B, hopefully, like actually get to the truth. The problem is, as you go through the dialogues, you realize that every single time Socrates has some kind of question he wants the answer to, no one's able to answer it, right? And so what we end up with is just zero. Like, we've definitely shown certain things aren't true, right? We've definitely shown, like, you can't possibly think that justice, as we see here, is always telling the truth, because sometimes telling the truth results in injustices. But we never actually get, like, a definition of what justice would be, ever. And so all of a sudden, in the middle period, and you'll see it here, Book 2 of the Republic. So after Book 1 ends, Book 1 is basically an aphoretic Socratic dialogue. They talk about justice for a while, no conclusion is arrived at, and so then normally that's when the dialogue would end. Then Book 2 starts, and Glaucon's like, yeah, no, we have to keep going, right? Because it seems like if I'm actually going to claim to be a lover of wisdom, shouldn't we start, like, positing ideas ourselves? And examining those and seeing if they actually are true? Because otherwise we're not building anything. We're not gaining any ground. We're just sort of cutting other people down. And while that's useful, sometimes you have to burn things down in order to rebuild, right? But then you have to rebuild, though. You can't just burn things down all the time. So, in these middle dialogues, and Republic's a great example of this, Socrates starts doing something that he never ever did before, which is he starts suggesting possible ideas. Right? So in the middle period in the Republic, he's like, look, because they're trying to figure out what the best possible city is. So he's sort of pushed into a corner. He's like, look, I'm not saying this is true. I'm not saying I believe this. But a bunch of people told me about this like city that they designed. And I think we should talk about it and examine whether or not it's got any merit. Now, the way that Socrates does this, what does this allow him to do?
Plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability, right? Anytime there's a problem, he's like, look, I didn't say I believe, I just said, like, someone else told me. Good thing you pointed that out so I can go tell them that it's wrong, right? So it allows Socrates that plausible deniability, but from, like, an outside perspective of, like, the actual story itself, it allows Plato to start inserting his own ideas and examining his own ideas. Socrates never wrote anything down, and from all accounts, Socrates never actually posited any ideas about anything ever. Right? All he ever did was the kind of questioning, because Socrates claimed he knew one thing, which was what? Right, he claims a self-awareness of his own ignorance, and that ignorance was pervasive, right? It's across everything. I mean, Socrates starts like, at certain points, Socrates will deny knowing things that like are obvious. Like at one point in the Phaedo, he goes, and you know, at a certain point, I had this intellectual crisis in my youth. I thought I knew stuff, and then I wasn't even sure if 1 + 1 = 2. And you're like, really? You really didn't know? So he's trying to like really push this idea that he doesn't have any actual knowledge at all. And so it allows Plato a mechanism where he can insert his own ideas into the dialogue and then have people critique these ideas within the dialogue. So it's like Plato working through these ideas through the characters in the dialogue. Another major shift. In the early dialogues, the only thing Socrates cares about is ethics and morality. That's it. In the middle period, all of a sudden he's asking like very deep metaphysical questions. And questions about epistemology, like what it means to know something, what is knowledge, etc. These are questions that early Socrates, and by many accounts, the historical Socrates, who was a real person, didn't really care about at all. Socrates as a person was concerned solely with what does it mean to live a good life. And so questions about being and non-being and what is knowledge itself, they don't really come into play. But the argument you could make is, if we don't know what it means to be human, how are we going to accurately create an ethical system that would allow humans to live the best possible life? So don't we have to ask metaphysical questions in order to present like a viable ethical system, right? So that's where Plato's coming from now. When you get to the late period, Socrates is kind of sidelined at this point. He's in the dialogues, but he kind of fumbles around a lot. He starts using different argumentative styles, which he's really not very good at. And then at the very end, second to last dialogue, he's literally there, but doesn't really say anything. And then in the last dialogue, the laws, he's not even there. It's someone completely different. So Plato just sort of, it's almost like Plato's evolving and creating his own style. But right here in the Republic, it's right in the middle, and we see a lot of like transitionary things happening. But another beautiful thing about the Republic is it covers every single topic that you could possibly want to cover within philosophy. So there are discussions of justice, that's the driving force of the whole thing. There are discussions of morality itself, of metaphysics, of aesthetics, of epistemology. So education, like we get pretty much everything all in this one book, and it's a singular story, all kind of complete. So I am very excited to read this as a whole with everybody and to really take our time with it, because I really do think that instead of just jumping around from like idea to idea, you'll get way more out of reading a complete work that has all these things in it. And so I'm hoping that's the case. And if there are questions along the way about like what does Plato mean by this, just ask, because it's probably in relation to something he said earlier, and I can fill you guys in how that goes. Good? All right, so let's get started. We see this opening line. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, the son of Ariston. So off the bat, Glaucon is Plato's brother in real life. Ariston is obviously Plato's father. So that's going to be important for later. But notice how Plato could insert literally anybody into this work. And the very first person that we meet is Plato's brother. Why? Why do you think that's important? Why in the opening line? So the opening line is important. So why is it important we establish Glaucon be there? What do you guys think? There's no right answer for this, or any of this, by the way.
He may have liked his brother more.
Than who?
Other people.
Yeah, he could have.
Maybe to be more familiar.
Right, so it could be like that this is someone who could be like a stand-in for Plato himself, like, or he could be establishing that this is something that's really important. Other things, no, Glaucon, yeah, go ahead.
Would it be like he'd rather put somebody that he knows instead of maybe a name of somebody else who already established as a philosopher, and like it just come across as putting words into their mouth?
Right, yeah, so it could be somebody that there's a familiarity with. Also, there's another additional thing which is never explicitly mentioned, but Glaucon, like Plato, was very much into mathematics, right? And as we're going to see, the distinction between subjective belief and objective knowledge is very, very important. And so what Plato's ultimate goal is with morality is to establish a kind of ethics or moral system that can be argued for objectively, right? So it's basically like we're going to establish moral proofs that have nothing to do with your beliefs, your biases, where you come from. It's just true because it's true, and we can prove it accordingly, right? So that's going to be a big, important factor of this. So they're going through the Piraeus, which is like they're basically going down to the harbor, effectively. And then they run into Polemarchus. But in order, this is important, to see like how quickly things happen. How does Socrates know that Polemarchus is behind him? What happens?
So like boy comes up and says, "Hey,
Does it say boy in your translation?
Slave.
Okay, it does say slave.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, because it's like, that is not what the word is. So the slave comes up to him. So what does that tell the reader about Polemarchus?
He has slaves.
That he is rich, he's wealthy. Right? So we're able to establish that this is a wealthy person just by that, without explicitly saying this. Right? So all these little nuances and details matter. Polemarchus, by the way, is Cephalus' son. Polemarchus was one of the people who, so right around the time of Socrates, there was a coup that was taken, so the Athenian government was taken over for a small period of time by a group of people that came to be known as the 30 Tyrants. Polemarchus was killed by them. So this is going to be, when we're talking about what is the best constitution, Polemarchus would have already been killed at this point. And so by putting Polemarchus at the center of this story and as a character who's there the entire time, the readers are already kind of clued into like, well, we need to get this right, because if we don't, it ends up with somebody like Polemarchus getting murdered by the government. And these are the things we want to avoid. Again, none of that is said, but if you know who these characters are, it sort of sets the stage for the importance of it. All right. So we then end up over at Polemarchus' house, which is the house of his father, Cephalus. And we see this so the numbers on the sides of your page, like you'll see like 328, and then it's like B, C, D, E. Do you guys have that in your translations? Those are called Stephanus numbers, right? Whenever I reference any number, it's always going to be those, right? Because that means they've written them this way because it doesn't matter what your translation is, it's going to follow where the Greek is. So if you want to keep track of where we're at, I'll name something like 328b. And then you can just kind of go there. Cool? All right. So at 328b, he said, so we went to Polemarchus' house, and there we found Lysias and Euthydemus, the brothers of Polemarchus, Thrasymachus of Chalcedon, Carmatides, Cleitophon, etc., etc. Polemarchus' father, Cephalus, was also there, and I thought he looked quite old. As I hadn't seen him for some time, he was sitting on a sort of cushioned chair with a wreath on his head, as he had been offering a sacrifice in the courtyard. There was a circle of chairs, and we sat down by him. So what are we learning from that? So it sounds just like a description. But he's telling us something about Cephalus right away. Which is what?
Religious.
He's what?
Religious.
He's religious, right? What else?
He's old.
Yeah, he's old, right? So we know he's religious. He had just been completing a sacrifice. A really important part of Athenian culture was maintaining your respect to the gods, which you did through committing sacrifices, right? So that was part of what it meant to be a good citizen. So here is Cephalus, which, by the way, is like a party in his house. And instead of just enjoying the party, what is he doing? He's being a good citizen and making sacrifices, right? So he's establishing Cephalus as far as like what it means from an Athenian perspective in a general sense, being a good citizen. Cephalus is it, right? And for those that read through, in a little bit, we're going to see Cephalus leaves. And he leaves to go do what?
Sacrifices.
Make more sacrifices, right? So he's like committed to being a good citizen this whole time. So then we get into some good stuff here. So moving on from there. As soon as he saw me, Cephalus welcomed me and said, Socrates, you don't come down to the Piraeus to see as often as you should. If it were still easy for me to walk to town, you wouldn't have to come here. We'd come to you. But as it is, you ought to come here more often, for you should know that the physical pleasures wither away. My desire for conversation and its pleasures grows. So do as I say. Stay with these young men now, but come regularly to see us just as you would to friends or relatives. This is actually a really important aspect of it, because he's saying as we grow older, our desires for physical pleasures, so things that we might find in town, drink, revelry, sex, etc., those sorts of things wither away. So you are all college-aged folk, and I imagine, do you guys have like party plans for the weekend already? I thought Georgia Southern was a party school. You should have parties tonight.
We have an essay to write.
In a week. Your philosophy majors, they said. You guys gotta live a little. I was a philosophy major too. I one time showed up, I'll just tell you. I woke up, and when I woke up, I didn't know where I was. Turns out I'd slept in my buddy's dorm room. The reason I didn't know where I was is because I didn't live in the dorm, so I had no idea what a dorm looked like. And then luckily I did that because class started in 10 minutes. So I made it to class. And my professor, who would show up stoned to class every day, he was like 70 years old. He was awesome. He looked like a mad scientist. Looked at me and went, and just laughed. And then that was it. That was our whole conversation. It was great. So I say this, don't do what I did, but have fun. You should have parties. Because you're young. Because when you get to my age, I have a friend who's 30. I'm almost 41 now. And he's like, hey man, we're going out tonight. It's Friday night. Let's go to this bar. And I'm like, oof. Yeah, what time? 9? Oof. Yeah, that sounds like it's going to go late. And 20 years ago, I didn't even go to parties until like 11 at night. Right? The idea of, actually, you guys know where Nats is? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I booked a show at Nats last year, and he said the show was from 10 to 1 on Saturday. Now, as a 41-year-old, when he said 10 to 1, what time did you think it was starting for me? I thought it was a brunch show. And when he told me, I was like, hey man, a week before the show, I was like, so I know you guys don't even know, is someone gonna be there to let me in, you know? And he goes, what are you talking about? I was like, well, if I get there at like 9, like, I gotta set up, I just wanna make sure you guys are gonna be open. He goes, dude, it starts at 10 at night. I was like, oh no. And I realized I had to play until 1 a.m. Dr. Ransom, who's only 32, by the way, I thought he should have been more excited about it. He was very upset about it too. But like as you get older, you just don't want to do these things anymore. It just seems exhausting. And instead you find yourself deriving more pleasure from simpler activities like reading books or having conversations. So this actually is true. now I'm only halfway there yet, but I would imagine it just keeps going like this, right? So we also learn he's old, he's losing this drive towards physical pleasures, becomes important, which then kind of triggers Socrates to ask him a question, right? Because he's noticed that he's been making these sacrifices. He notices that he's old. He's mentioned that he doesn't have these drives for pleasure. And so he asks him, he's like, so is being old terrible? Right? Because you just mentioned you can't go to town anymore. That just seems problematic. Because Socrates is like an anomaly. He's like 71 years old and he's still drinking everyone under the table. Right? So what's Kepla's response as far as like, is being old a difficult time? It seems like the poets call old age not a great time. If you talk to most people who are old, what are they going to say about it?
Sucks.
It sucks. What's Kepler's response?
Great.
Why?
He's no longer he's no longer driven by his bodily desires. He actually has this clarity of mind that allows him to just be able to think rationally and without all this outside influence.
Exactly. Now I want you to think about that. That could come with old age. And he's using Kepler as an example of this. But what do you think Plato's also saying?
Isn't there also something about like wealth, about like how Kepler does have wealth, so he lives more comfortably?
Yes. But notice how he says, for him, he has wealth, he lives more comfortably. But he notes that he has rich friends who it's not that money makes you happier just by default.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that old age makes you miserable by default. He's pointing out for him, old age is better because he's no longer overcome by his youthful passions. And money makes it easier because he is concerned about finances in a specific way, right? But you could be very wealthy and miserable, right? It's just the link between those two is, as Will said, his frame of mind, right? And a frame of mind, one that is focused on conversations, which again, as is in the beginning, like dialogue, right? That we're going to be engaging in dialogue to sort of acquire some kind of truth. That is the key for Plato right off the bat. Like, this is what it means to live a good life, right? This is somebody who has gotten it figured out. Now, it just so happens with Cephalus, he's responding to things in certain ways that let him come to this realization. But Plato is not saying you need to be old to live this kind of way, right? Also, does an interest in physical pleasures mean you can't live a philosophical life? No, because look at Socrates. Socrates is not only partying with people, drinking all the time, but if you've ever read any of their dialogues in the Crito, it's made clear that Socrates apparently fathered children well into his late 60s and 70s. Right? So obviously he's still enjoying sex quite a bit. And so the point is maybe to see it as a kind of a moderation, right? Like a kind of balance. And Cephalus seems to establish that. He's wealthy, but he's not too wealthy. What could happen if you're too wealthy? Okay. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, are they good or bad people?
I don't know.
You're bad people.
Yeah, so we would assume they're bad people. Why? What do we think has happened to them?
Goes to their head.
They've become corrupted.
I was going to say because they got their money by stepping on people. You
What?
can't get that money ethically.
That's what we assume. You know, maybe they built a good company. You don't think there are good companies?
Sure. I'm sure there are some out there.
Okay. You don't believe that at all, though, I can tell. So, this idea. He says, I am wealthy, I am old. Because of this, I no longer have these desires, etc. Then when people get old, the thing they talk about and complain about the most are these lost pleasures. I'm not going through it because I'm looking at things differently, right? So then, because of this, he asks him to define justice, because it seems like Cephalus is a just person, right? Even when he's talking about money here, right? He's talking about, notice how there's still a balance in this. So this is at 330b. He asks him where his money came from. He's like, are you the kind of person who inherited the money, or are you the kind of person who made the money? And he's like, well, my father made a whole bunch of money. What's his grandfather was? Yeah, his grandfather made all the money. And what happened with his father when his father inherited it?
He spent most of
He
it.
spent most of it, right? So he wasted it. Cephalus managed to bring it back. Not as rich as his grandfather, but he made more money than his father. Which means, again, there's like a balance. There's like a middle ground. It seems like this becomes this sort of theme that we're pushing for when we're talking about justice, some kind of way in which we're not going to extremes on either side. Everything seems to be working together into a system. So, we recognize, also another thing we see here, that he has enough money, like the things he's concerned about with money is, I have enough money to leave money for my sons where they should be well off. It's almost like if they blow that money, that's not on me. Like I left them with enough to live a good life. So then he asks them about justice. So we go down to 331 is where we really get started here. I'll say this too. The 331b, when he's talking about it, let me ask you guys this. Why is it important, as far as justice is concerned, that Cephalus have a good amount of wealth? What does he say as far as like how this connects to him being a just person? Yeah.
Well, I think if you didn't have that wealth when it comes to justice, your desire for money or wealth might skew your view of what could be just or not.
So give me an example.
I guess, if you think about people who steal, even Robin Hood, about justification to steal from the rich or the poor.
Mm-hmm.
The story is that he is just because of the way he's doing it, is taking from the rich.
Right.
So I guess because he already has that money, his view of justice can't be skewed by the fact that, he's not desiring something that like overpowers his sense of justice.
Right, so like if he has too much money, and this goes to the Fortune 500 CEO thing, the vast majority of them, I would agree, money becomes, and avarice, like for not just wealth, but for power, it sort of corrupts you, because it becomes, I was actually reading something about John D. Rockefeller, right? So when a competitor who ran a railroad that would ship Rockefeller's oil had a monopoly on like the Pittsburgh area where Rockefeller had a bunch of refineries, right? That guy wanted to get into the oil business and become a competitor to Rockefeller. So what Rockefeller did, because the guy had a stranglehold on shipping, Rockefeller just shut down his refineries in Pittsburgh for months, which ended up in Rockefeller losing something like $80 million, right? And he shut down the factories, and he did that to beat the guy. Right? So it became like, I am so concerned with power that I'm going to actually like harm people, to your point. Like I'm harming these workers on purpose so I can win. And it was actually not even helping him at all because he's losing money, but he did it to win. So it can corrupt your sense of like what accomplishment is. And on the flip side of that, if you are very poor and you are hungry, what might you do? Steal to eat, right? We might say, well, it's justified because you're starving, but aren't you stealing from someone? Like who runs a shop? What if their shop isn't all that successful and they need that money to feed their own kids? Right? So questions of committing actions, in other words, even if we can have a debate on whether or not stealing food from somebody is just or unjust depending on how hungry somebody is, the question is, because I don't have wealth, I am forced into these actions. Whereas if I have enough money, I don't have to worry about these things, so I'm like balanced, basically. It provides me with the freedom to not be forced into these sorts of situations. Okay, good. So moving on to C then, Socrates finally asks him, like, what justice is. And so we're looking at 331d. We see, so before that, C. He basically says that justice is always telling the truth and returning what is borrowed, or repaying what is borrowed. What's the issue with that? So this is Cephalus' attempt at defining justice. He says justice is telling the truth and always repaying what is owed. What could go wrong? Somebody new?
I think there was that one example of a murderer trying to find someone who hides in your house.
Mm-hmm.
So if he asks you, hey, is the person here, and you tell the truth, it'll lead to the person dying.
Right, so like if you're hiding your friend from a murderer, which that is horrifying, first of all. What kind of life are you living? But if you're hiding your friend from a murderer and the murderer knocks on your door and asks you if your friend is hiding in your basement, what are you supposed to say?
According to him, yes.
According to Cephalus, you'd be like, well, yep. It's like, shit, you got me. Yeah, he's in the basement. Jim, come out. I'm like, no, that wouldn't be good, right? So, obviously, telling the truth isn't always a just thing to do, right? What about returning what is borrowed, repaying your debts? Should you always repay your debts? Why not? What could go wrong? Yeah.
You steal a weapon from a serial killer and they ask for it back.
Why? Why are you? Wow, that's awesome. I agree, but you are really rolling the dice, right? Like, if I knew someone was a serial killer, I wouldn't steal anything from them. But you're right? If you wouldn't steal it though. It'd be like if the serial killer lent it to you.
Borrowed it.
Right, you borrowed the serial killer's knife for some reason. You know.
Chainsaw.
Yeah, like, exactly. So you borrowed his chainsaw, and he's just like, listen, I'm really itching. So I'm gonna go out, I need to kill some people. I'm gonna need that chainsaw back. If you could, just lickety-split. If you give back the serial killer chainsaw after that conversation, are you promoting justice?
Well,
According to Cephalus, his definition, you should give it back. But obviously, that's crazy, and that's not just. And so Socrates just immediately just completely destroys the whole argument, right? Now, what happens next? Somebody else, somebody new. What happens? Yeah.
He just leaves.
He leaves. As we said, where's he go?
sacrifices?
Right, but he leaves his house. If you're going to go make proper sacrifices, you're going to do that at the temple. I want you guys to think about something. What did Cephalus say to Socrates about him coming to visit?
You should do it more.
Why?
Because he likes to talk.
But why does Socrates have to come to him? Because it's really difficult for him to get to town. Where are the temples? In town. Which means Cephalus is not only leaving his own party, which is weird already, right? But he's doing something he just said was really hard for him to do in order to make the sacrifices he needs to make for society. Yeah.
Isn't that multiple times in one day? Because he's already like wearing the stuff from
Exactly.
the sacrifice.
He's already made a sacrifice in his own house during a party, so he's went away from the festivities. Now he's leaving the party, making from his perspective, the arduous journey all the way to town to make a sacrifice, which just shows again how committed he is to being a good citizen. And that matters because Socrates lets him leave. Now, what was his definition of justice again? Returning chainsaws to serial killers when you borrow them. If you actually believe that you should always repay your debts despite any circumstances or consequences that would make that a problematic position to hold, don't you think Socrates would want him to stick around and be like, well, I need you to admit that that's wrong, and let's talk about why you think that's the case, just to make sure that you're not going out into the world with this really warped, potentially dangerous definition of justice. In fact, Socrates always does that. He never just lets people leave. He's always like, well, okay, I know you're getting frustrated, but let's start over and take a breath. But here, he just goes, all right, see you later. Why? What's different? Melissa, yeah.
Because at this point, he's just set in his ways. He's not going to really learn anything new because he doesn't want to learn anything new or can't.
Right, so we do know that Cephalus is old, right? And old people, not all of them, but I would say most, are very set in their ways, right? You guys have grandparents. How's that go when you're like, you should watch this new show or movie, or don't say things like that? And what's the response from your grandparents?
Just say it again.
Yeah, they're like, wow, what's wrong with it? Back in my day, we did it all the time. It's like, yeah, I know. Doesn't make it good. So people who are old are very set in their ways, right? So we could spend time trying to debate what Cephalus said, but that's going to be a whole lot of effort spent on something that probably won't stick in the first place, right? Second, is Cephalus actually a danger?
No.
How do we know that?
to make sacrifices.
He wants to make sacrifices. It never says that Cephalus is a good person explicitly, but it does tell us multiple times that Cephalus has made sacrifices. He is now doing something that's difficult for him to go make another sacrifice. He's leaving his own party. We know he's got a balanced soul because of the way he describes his current life. From Socrates' perspective, like, yeah, I mean, his definition of justice might be off, but A, he never, like, claims that I'm an expert in justice, right? He's just sort of, Socrates kind of brings the question up to him. And B, based on the way he actually lives his life, he seems like he's actually a just guy, right? He may not know the definition and be able to explain it, but the way he lives is evidence that we don't really need to be concerned about Cephalus going out into the wild and committing atrocities. Further, having Cephalus leave like this allows, as I said last time, for another dramatic device, literary device to be used, which is the introduction of Polemarchus. And Polemarchus is who? Cephalus' son. So this represents what?
Younger generation.
Yeah, changing the guard, the younger generation. Exactly. Right? And Polemarchus comes in. Where is it? So this one takes a little longer. So at 332, all the way through, for a while, actually, he's talking about this. So what's his definition of justice?
Give to friends and harm to enemies.
Yes, so he's basically arguing that we should be good to our friends, help our friends, and we should harm our enemies. Now, this leads Socrates, like, so we're talking now 332, right, DCE. He's trying to determine here, before he gets into like the nitty-gritty of the problems with Polemarchus' argument, what exactly justice is for. So what's like the goal of justice? When I act justly, what am I trying to do within society?
Make it better.
Make it better for who?
Everyone.
Everyone. So we would say that when I act justly, I'm acting to the advantage of the person I'm acting towards, right? So if I'm committing a just action, it's supposed to be advantageous for everybody. Now that makes sense if we're going to say, oh, and always, right? The thing about justice is it's always, if done properly, justice is always advantageous to everybody. That's a perfectly just society would operate accordingly. We don't leave anybody behind. And we definitely don't elevate certain groups at the cost of others, right? And Plato's actually pretty explicit about that. Although there's some arguments we'll get to later that are problematic. So, if it comes to helping our friends and harming our enemies, what are some problems that could arise? Let's get some new people. Anyone hasn't spoken yet? Yes?
Your friends aren't necessarily always good people.
Yeah! Your friends might be awful, actually. We are like horrible judges of character, typically. Because you ever had a friend, or like worse, you ever like dated somebody, right? And then they do something and you're like, oh, you are not the person that I thought you were. Like, which I've always found that when someone does that, when you date someone and they do something that you just did not think they were capable of doing, they're doing you a favor. Right? Because that means that they were definitely not the person that you thought they were, which means it's really easy to break up with them. They saved you years, right? So like, if someone cheats on you, I know that sucks. But then you're like, whew, clean break. Because like, obviously is anyone here dated someone that they thought was going to cheat on them? That'd be a weird dating setup. So obviously you assume that they're the kind of person who wouldn't do that. And so if they do, you're like, great, see you later. Because that's not who I thought you were. Does that make sense to everybody? Same thing here. Like, we think initially that you're friends with people because you think they're good people. That's why you're friends with them. But what is a really distinct possibility?
They're bad people.
Yeah. Then you got to ask the next question. If you're friends with bad people, what does that say about you?
Well, what if everyone's bad? Then what?
But not everyone's bad.
Are you sure?
Yeah, well, at the very least, there's a scale, I would say. I'm hoping that none of you guys are Nazis. Some of your faces worry me a little bit. You're like, fuck, he's looking at me. Yeah,
The argument you were just talking about, or saying what justice is for the good of everybody.
yeah, it's advantageous towards you, yeah.
So the claim itself to be good to your friends and cause harm to enemies, isn't that a direct contradiction to advantageous for everybody?
Yes, why? Well, so a counter argument, but I'll actually explain what you say first, and I'll give like a counter. Okay.
Well, even though the people that are enemies to you, I mean, in their eyes, you're their enemy as well. So I don't know how you made that distinction of whether or not they're bad or they're just not good to you. So to harm them, it's just not advantageous to everybody. You're just looking out for yourself, basically, not everyone.
Or those that you care about, right? So, but I see your point, right?
Selfish almost.
Yeah, so it could be selfish. Yeah, let's see something.
Yeah, I do. It kind of goes onto your point. So, I believe that in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece, like slaves were commonly from, like prisoners of war, I guess.
They were mostly prisoners of war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I know that they weren't really considered part of society, but at the same time, I mean, they're doing parts in your society. So at that point in time, that's how it kind of contradicts everything, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, because you're saying that Plato's saying that a just society is advantageous to everyone
Yes.
within society.
Yes.
And on some foundation, the slaves are contributing to society, but the society that's holding them as slaves is not being advantageous to them.
And even like those slaves are doing good to their enemies in a way.
Well, I mean, they don't kill the slaves.
Yeah, but that's a pretty low bar.
I mean, I'm
That's
like they get to live.
Yeah. So, yeah. So so from a Greek perspective, I'll give you two quick things on that. Neither of which are very good, but might put what the Greek response to this would be in context. So for Aristotle actually defends slavery, which is horrifying. And he does it like in a really shitty way, not just ethically, but like logically. But his basic argument is if anybody, and a lot of Greeks would believe this, right? So from a Greek perspective, anyone that would surrender in battle obviously doesn't have the rational capacity required to be considered fully human. Because from Aristotle's argument, the argument would be anyone who thinks that a life of slavery is better than dying in battle and defending your freedom obviously needs, as Aristotle kind of puts it, like oversight. Which is problematic for a number of reasons. So just to give you like a general Greek perspective, and people would believe this, right? They would say like, well, it's better to die fighting as a free person than to give up. So on the other side, for Plato, you're right. The slaves weren't considered really part of the polis. So the polis is the city, right? And so even though Plato doesn't explicitly say this, it could just be he's operating from an understanding of justice that we are concerned with our society, right? So like when I say I'm acting justly to the advantage of my society, I'm not talking about other societies. I'm not even talking about other city-states. Like, I don't give a shit about what Sparta's doing. I'm talking about how do I act in the best way possible for Athens, if I'm an Athenian. Right? Because, Sparta, I might have to kill Spartans. And that would be, in that moment, the just thing to do to protect Athens. Yes?
So, this is really hard to define it, but when he says enemy, armed enemy, is that only refer to out of society, or even would that term apply to like political enemies?
Yeah, no, it's probably more referring to like people within society. You gotta remember, people didn't really have a lot of contact with people outside of their city-state, right? It'd be like, how often do you guys talk to folks in Germany? Like every every Tuesday, or you call someone up randomly?
What
Like,
do you mean,
hey.
like we go to Germany?
No, like how often do you stay in touch with folks in Germany?
Well, I don't speak
Well,
German.
yeah, what about China or Brazil or hell, Virginia? Right? I mean, we don't. And we have access. We could. Like, you could literally call, there are apps where you can just literally call random people on that app, and it turned into something gross pretty quick. But you could, and it's just like this, like it's a roulette of chat, basically, video chat. You can imagine where that would go very badly, very quickly. So the point is, we could talk to literally anyone in the world if we wanted to, and we don't. In the ancient world, like, you were pretty much, like, you might have a friend or two that have traveled to other places, but typically your everyday and all your life interactions are going to be within the city-state that you live in. The most contact you're going to have with people outside of that is probably going to be through war, right? So when he's talking, he is talking about what's best for, in fact, in the Republic, the idea of other competing city-states comes up. And he explicitly says, like, look, we can't really be concerned about what other people are doing. In fact, we have to keep them out because the influence that they could have upon our citizens is potentially problematic. So we just kind of shut our gates to everybody else except for people who are already here. And in fact, he goes, and what we should really do is send propaganda to all these other city-states of our society because it'll basically, like a virus, cause political turmoil in their societies, which will cause them to collapse, and then they'll be less of a threat to us. Which is an idea that the Germans in World War I did to Russia. So, do you guys know how Lenin got back to Russia to start what became the Soviet Revolution?
The Germans shipped them there.
The Germans? So Lenin was exiled to, like, at this point, I think he was in, like, the Netherlands or something. And the Germans, who really didn't like Lenin, were like, what if we took Lenin, we put him on a crane, and we sealed all the doors and windows so no one could see who's in there, and we sent him through the front, like, all the fighting, all the way across. We sent him into Russia like we're dropping a virus in there, and then maybe he can, like, spread socialism, and then they'll take over the government, and then Russia will be out of the war. Turns out, it worked. But then something happened that they didn't expect, which was, while this was happening, before Russia was totally out of the war, well, the Russian soldiers were hearing all about socialism, which sounded great to them. And then, what do you think they did when, they were, like, being held prisoner by the Germans? Told them all about socialism. Now all of a sudden the German soldiers are like, wow, this socialism thing sounds pretty great. And the Germans are like, no. So unintended consequences occurred. But Plato basically suggests the same thing. He's like, we'll send, like, agents and spies in there, and they'll tell them about our government, which they won't be able to do because they don't have the truth and they don't have the philosophers. So they'll try and they'll fail and it'll just all fall apart. That's, like, literally something Socrates suggests. So when I say, like, when we're talking about justice, really we are talking about within our society, right? Because here's the thing. If we can't fix our society, what the hell good is trying to fix other people's places? Like, you have to take care of your own house first. It seems to be what Plato's suggesting. So, when you say political enemies, yeah, I'm talking about in society. But this raises a really interesting question. Like, obviously, the first problem with Polemarchus' definition is we don't know whether or not our friends are good or bad people. It's really hard to figure that out. Like, we think we know, but we can be surprised all the time. Or, flip side, we might be bad people, and we're not even aware of it, right? Like, no one in history is a Bond villain, I like to say. Because, like, Bond villain, like James Bond, like, the villains in James Bond movies are, like, doing evil shit for, like, no reason. Right? They're like, and then I'll destroy the world by exploding all the volcanoes. You're like, why? Why would you do that? And there's like, because I'm evil. Like, no one's like that. No one really does that. Whenever someone does the worst things in history, at the time, those people committing those terrible actions genuinely believed that what they were doing was right. Like, the Nazis You can read it. They really believed that, like, the Holocaust was a good idea. And it wasn't because they were like, and we're evil and we do bad things. Like, this is actually, the Nazis' justification for the genocide that they committed was, from their perspective, a purification of the human race. So from their idea, like, purifying things is good, this is bad, we should kill everybody. That's really what they thought. So we could be bad people and not realize it. And if we're helping our friends, they're probably bad too, and that's bad. So that's a problem, right? But what I'm bringing up now with this, and you bring it up too with harm, let's imagine we could know. Let's imagine we could know for a fact that our friends are actually good people. Like they really are. We know it. Somehow. Should we help them in the name of justice? Oh my God, yes, you should. Why would
That
you?
was a trick question.
No! That was a softball. It was a beach ball. Yes, if your friends are good, you should help. Oh my God, don't tell your friends that just happened. That just reminds me of one of the worries that I had when I was teaching the love class was that it would cause people to break up with their partners. And there was a couple questions I would ask where I'd see people's face like, and like when you're with your partner, you think this about them, right? And they go, and I was like, oh, that was not long. That's gonna be good. One kid admitted, he's like, I'm having a lot of problems with my girlfriend now. I was like, I'm sorry. He goes, because of your class. And I was like, oh no, shit. Hope it's for the best. But let's imagine, okay, so your friends are actually good. We should help them in the name of justice, obviously. But what if your enemies are like literally actually bad? Like you have political enemies that you know are cheating, lying, stealing, manipulating, destroying people's lives for their own personal gain of money and power. Should we harm them? Yeah, should it be?
According to the arguments, you shouldn't, because when you harm something, it makes it worse, and it'll just progress the more you do it. So it's like they mentioned, like hitting a horse or hitting a dog, like it causes them to act worse instead of better. So.
Right. So like if we're gonna say like what is it? We have to ask the question like what does it mean to harm somebody, right? Because I mean there are gonna be people who would argue like of course you should harm them, right? Like if people are like committing these atrocities. Well, we see it all the time. Let's take this into a modern context, right? There was a thing not so long ago, like where I don't have social media, so I have no idea what this was on. I'm gonna guess at the time, 5 years ago, what would that be? Instagram? 5 years ago, ish. Twitter. Okay. So the question was going around: is it okay to punch Nazis? Remember that? Like you guys remember that? That was like a thing. Like people were asking that question, which, like, is it just to punch Nazis? So, obviously, the person who thinks that it is good or just to punch Nazis believes that if you're a Nazi, you have done terrible things, and because you've done terrible things, you deserve to be harmed. That's the argument. Another way of looking at it is if somebody, like, murders your family,
Or the dog.
actually, let's go with that. That seems like more, definite, kill them for sure. Right? Nothing against my family, but it's my dog. Yeah, so if someone kills your dog in front of you and then like eats it. Laughing. The whole time, just laughing. Giggling like a 4-year-old. I'm like, oh God. And then it's worse.
Can you punch them?
The what?
Can you punch them?
Should we harm them? Should they be punished in a way that's harming them for them, in the name of justice, it'd be like, you have to pay for what you've done, right? And that's the argument we'll make. So what do you guys think of that? Is that true? Should people be forced to pay for what they've done, the crimes they've committed? And is that actually something that is going to be beneficial to them or society in the name of justice? Yeah, good.
I don't think punishment for punishment's sake is good. I think it's good if there's like a good purpose for it.
Okay, yeah, you're right. So if we're just punishing for punish, but like when people typically think that it's good for society, what's their argument, right? So get into the head of somebody who's like, yes, they should be punished. What are they arguing? Yeah.
So like, I think in some ways it can be like rehabilitation,
Okay.
but like, I don't think you can always rehabilitate somebody. Like, I think there's a line, like, if somebody's eating a puppy and laughing, like, rehabilitation, I'm not sure about that one, you know?
You made it worse. You made it a puppy.
Oh, was it just a dog?
Yeah, I mean, still bad enough, but I was like, how did you make it worse? You made it a puppy.
My
That's how you
dog's
make it worse.
always But like, so I think like repaying, I think there's a way like you can like pay for like, yes, like serve time. Like if you've committed a terrible act, like you serve time for it and hopefully you're rehabilitated for it. But if you did a terrible act, like, I don't know. I think it has to do with like rehabilitation. Like if they are able to become a virtuous person.
Okay, good. We're gonna come back to that for a second, but yeah, good.
Okay, so are we talking about like inflicting bodily harm? Are we talking about incarceration?
We're talking about harming them. So it could be bodily harm, it could be psychological harm, it could be,
Okay.
yeah.
Because like I took philosophy of incarceration and we talked about punishment and like rehabilitation and prison abolition and stuff like that. So if like the goal is to prevent someone from doing something, punishing them is probably not going to work. It might feel good to hurt them, but if we're talking about like actually change their behavior, probably nothing's going to change. Yeah.
So to build on what you both said, Plato agrees with both of you. So Plato thinks, like, the idea, if you're giving it the most charitable reading, the idea would be something like, I'm going to punish you and you're going to learn your lesson, right? So think like corporal punishment. Like, I stole something,
Hand gone.
Yeah, exactly. Cut your hand off, won't steal. Well, you might steal one more time, but after that.
Then you can't.
After that, it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough. So the idea would be you're learning your lesson. Plato's like, yeah, but you don't. Right? So for Plato, he thinks rehab. In fact, he's pretty extreme about it. So not in the Republic, but in the Laws, which is his other major political treatise, Plato says, if you commit murder, like first degree, premeditated, you track someone down on purpose to murder them for your own personal gain, that person, in the ancient world, Plato's like, no, you don't put them to death. See, the thing is, if someone does something like that, they're obviously so ignorant that they don't recognize how horrible that is, so we should rehab them. Like you go to like murder rehab, basically. And then he says, if you get out of murder rehab and you do it again, then you go to rehab again. Because it didn't stick, that's on us. Then if you do it a third time, then we kill you. But not to punish you, it's to help you. Because you are obviously someone who just cannot help themselves and you're doing these horrible things. And the only way to stop you is to kill you. And we don't want to put you in jail because then we're making you suffer. And we don't want to like actually harm you. We're not trying to, right? It's almost like it's not your fault. It's a matter of ignorance. And another thing that Plato's going to say, I know we're running out of time here, I want to get a little bit farther, but to build on it is, for him, harming someone, you're right, might make you feel better, but it definitely doesn't help them. And if we're talking about justice is harming your enemies, justice is about improving somebody. Justice is about making someone a better person. If I'm already the kind of person who does terrible things, now I don't know if you guys know a lot of bad people. I made it sound like I do. I don't. But like, I always tell the story, like when I was a kid, I got bullied, like through like 7th grade probably. And this one kid, his name, did I tell you guys about Danny Spatucci? Okay, that's his real name. I know it sounds like an 80s high school movie, but for real, his name was Danny Spatucci. I think he's in jail now. So I'll never forget. So he used to, for some reason, he just singled me out. And he would pick on me all the time, like classic 90s shit, like stuff you in a locker. I couldn't fit in the locker because I was bigger. But he's tried. Give him A+ on that. And so my dad finally was like, here's what you do. Next time he comes up to you, just punch him as hard as you can in the face. And so I did that. And in my mind, that would magically stop the problem. What do you think happened when I punched Danny Spatucci in the face as hard as I could? Do you think he went, oh shit, I'm so sorry. I was wrong the whole time. Thank God you hurt me, because now I see the error of my ways.
No.
Now, what happened? What do you think happened?
He punched you.
He didn't just punch me back, he beat the shit out of me, which is way worse than anything he had ever done before. Why? Because he's a horrible human being. And when you cause pain or you hurt or harm bad people, what do when you harm something? You're making it worse. Right? So Plato's example here, Socrates' example, he's like, if we want to harm a horse, how do you harm a horse? What's like the best way? Break its legs, right?
Poor thing.
Yeah, they know. Well, I mean, there was a class, it happened again this semester when in my intro class. It was like, how would you harm a horse? And this girl just yells out, you cut off its legs. And I was like, Jesus Christ. But effective, right? I mean, that horse isn't going anywhere. And that's what horses do, right? Horses run. But if you break a horse's leg, it's actually worse because it'll constantly keep trying to stand up, which means it's going to constantly hurt that leg. And you turned it into a pretty shitty horse, right? It's like bad at being a horse. Can't run anymore, can't pull anything anymore. We can't even ride it, so like societally it's a bad horse. So if we're harming something, we're making it worse. If we take someone who's already a bad person and we harm them, it's not going to make them better. It's going to make them worse, right? And if you look at any documentation about the prison system, you will find that the more severe the punishments are, the more likely the person who suffers those punishments commits more violent crimes. You're breaking their psyche, you're destroying aspects of themselves, and you're basically teaching them that this is how people are supposed to be treated. And it's really, really vicious and insidious. And Plato is recognizing this 2,400 years ago. Plato wants to abolish completely any kind of incarceration where we're just locking people up. He wants it to replace entirely literal schools. Like if you steal something, you go to school for why you shouldn't steal. That's it. That's what Plato wants. Yeah.
What if you adjusted the framing of the argument and instead of saying that bad people deserve to be harmed, as a good person, you reserve the right to retaliate?
Well, what would you gain justice-wise by retaliating? Vengeance, of course. Like the goal in justice is to make everyone that I'm acting towards, if I'm acting in the name of justice towards you, if I'm acting properly in terms of justice, it should be advantageous to you, not just to me. Right? So if I retaliate against you, how is that helping you?
What if you actually knock sense into somebody?
Like literally?
It's a phrase for a reason. It has to.
It did not work for Danny Spatucci. I can tell you with authority. And he didn't get any better. He's still pretty rough. I don't know him anymore. I only heard he was in jail. I just hope that's true. Do I hold a grudge? Yeah, a little bit. But yeah, so retaliation, that's something that Socrates is going to say that you're not actually thinking about justice. You're thinking selfishly about yourself. Right, so quite often justice means that we have to put aside something that we want, that we think is beneficial to us, because that's not what justice is about. Justice is about acting in such a way as to be advantageous to everyone in society. And that often means thinking in terms of what's best for society, not at all what's best for me. Which is sort of not really how we're brought up. We're told that justice requires sacrifice, but when Plato's talking about acting in such a way as towards the best of society, he means and look at Kephalus, right? We need to get rid of our youthful passions. We need to get rid of our desires for just our own gratification, right? And retaliation is simply that. It's just us trying to attain our own gratification in the situation, whether or not it's beneficial to society, right? I don't want to get too far ahead on that because we're going to get somewhere soon, but you'll see how that idea of acting towards what's best for society, not what's best for you, is a major component in Plato's Republic, big time. Okay, so we're at 5:15, is that what it is? Wow, that went by fast. Okay, one thing I want to say before we get out of here, because you can tell, we went really through that, but this is what it's going to be like. You can see how you can get a lot of discussion out of very few pages. right? And there was obviously a lot more to say, but I want to say one thing. The next person that walks in, so I'll sort of set the stage. Well, actually, I want to show you something. On 334D through E. Now, when you're reading Polemarchus, all about his definition of justice, you will notice that, unlike Cephalus, who just leaves, Polemarchus is like, no, I still believe what I said earlier, even though you're making all these points. It's not until 334D where Polemarchus says, no, that's not just at all, Socrates. My account must be a bad one. It takes Polemarchus a while to admit that he no longer believes what he said first, even though Socrates is giving him reasons. He's like, yeah, but I understand what you're saying as to why it might be bad, but I don't believe it yet, or I don't dismiss this yet. That is very important for Plato in general. When Socrates is talking to somebody in the Socratic method, one of the requirements, if we're actually, this is important for you too, if we're actually going to get anywhere in philosophical debate, as odd as this sounds, because it's Socrates, it's really important that you actually say what you believe. Not for Socrates. Socrates lies all the time. But Socrates is lying because he's not the one who said, I believe something. Right? So it's the other person's like, I think that justice is this. If you're lying about that, and Socrates grills you question after question, we're not really going to get anywhere because you didn't actually believe it in the first place, which means you're not genuinely interested in determining whether or not that's true. The reason why Socrates gets to lie is because he thinks, like, if I can fool you into actually saying things that you believe that you wouldn't have said before, now we're actually making progress, right? But he's doing it, he says, for the greater good. And also Socrates can't ever say what he actually believes, because why?
Doesn't know anything.
Socrates claims I don't know anything, right? The one thing he knows is that he knows nothing. So he can't say what he believes because he doesn't believe anything. Now, where we're going from here is we have Thrasymachus, right? He comes in right around 336 there, and Thrasymachus is actually a very, very, very famous sophist in Athens at the time. People paid him a lot of money to go learn how to argue, to go learn how to best people like Socrates. Plato really doesn't like the sophists. Now, up until Plato, the sophists, if you called someone a sophist, you were giving them a compliment. Sophist literally means wise person, right? Plato is the one who turned sophist. We have the word sophistry, which now has a very negative connotation to it. This is a person who's like, they put up a good game. It sounds like they're saying stuff. It sounds like they're smart. But really, they're just, it's like they're like a magician, right? Think like modern day politicians. Sophists, all of them. They all say they care about the truth, but nary a one actually does. What are they all in it for? Power, right? If they were a genuine politician, they wouldn't hold office because there's no way in fucking hell they'd get elected. Right? You have to lie to get the office, and the only reason you're sacrificing with stuff. But Thrasymachus is very, very famous in real life. People pay him a lot of money. Notice here, he won't even start talking. He won't even give his arguments until someone pays him. Like Glaucon is like, dude, I got your money. Here, start talking. Right? And that's important. But here's the thing. Thrasymachus gives a really good argument. Thrasymachus is not Polemarchus. He's not Cephalus. Thrasymachus is very, very good at this. And so there are scholarly papers that have been written that says Socrates does not win the argument against Thrasymachus. Like, Thrasymachus actually wins. He makes a better case. And he caves when he shouldn't. And it's obvious that he shouldn't, right? So when you're reading this, because this is the main thrust, this is where Socrates has a real, actual competitor, right? There's a real challenge here in what Thrasymachus is saying. And it's important that you recognize the distinction here. Remember I said at the beginning, the difference between dialogue and heuristic, right? Thrasymachus is coming in, charging like a bull, like he's about to start a boxing match, right? They even kind of describe him in this way, that he's willing to fight. Well, if you're in a boxing match, what's the goal of boxing? To win. To annihilate your opponent, to knock them out, basically. To get them to submit. That's the goal. The goal is not to box. The goal is to stop boxing by winning. Yeah.
If Thrasymachus, cares so little about the argument that he won't even start.
No. He cares immensely about the argument. He doesn't give a shit about the truth.
Okay, well, I guess,
That's what Plato says. Yeah.
so what is when I read it, I figured there has to be more meaning behind the way that he enters the argument, because it's so dramatic and aggressive, and it literally says like they're scared for their life.
Yep.
The second he tries to start arguing, what's like the importance of that?
So he's emotionally invested.
But he had to get paid to get involved.
Right. So he's really painting for somebody who gets in a bad light, right? So we see he won't start talking. He cares so much, but he has to get paid to do it, which that's sort of a jab at the sophists, right? They care about something, but they still got to get paid. And two, the fact that he's allowing his emotions to sort of take control, right? He's not coming in this cool, collected, rational. Socrates or Plato is basically writing in like, this is not how you should engage in philosophical debate. Philosophical debate is not done, it's definitely not done well when we come in like hot, as it were, angry, trying to like tear down the views of another person. True philosophical debate is done even if we categorically disagree in a profound way about what we're talking about. We're not going to get anywhere if we come in angry, because we're not allowing ourselves to see the arguments of the other side, which even if we don't like the conclusions, if we're genuine about the things that we believe, hearing the argument of the side might actually make our arguments better. Right? And if the other person's concerned with the truth too, they give you their best arguments, you show them the problems of their arguments, which might make them change their mind, but it also makes your mind sharper because you're actually engaging with people on the other side. You ever like just talk to people who already agree with you? You're not actually arguing. You're just like, yeah, like if we're on Plato's side, it's like, yeah, the prison system's bad, right? And everyone's like, yeah, it is. We're like, yeah, we're right. We haven't made an argument. How do you know? You find someone who loves the prison system. Say, give me your best argument. I want to know why you think this is a good idea, and listen to them honestly. And then you argue against, they say something, you say something, and back, and you're both genuinely working towards something. To shut down debate because we don't like the ideas the person's saying is called misology.
It's like a devil's advocate.
It's not even devil's advocate. You're just shutting it down because you don't care. If I literally say, I don't care what your points of view are, what does that say about my actual quest for the truth? It seems to suggest that I don't actually want the truth. I just want what I already think to be the truth to be the truth. But it's precisely because the thing we believe is true that we think it's so important. So we owe it to ourselves, Socrates is saying, to never shut down debate, ever. But also to never come in so angry and aggressive that we don't actually listen to what the other person's saying. Right? And if you can get paid to do it, I don't agree, you should get paid. If you're good at something, never do it for free. That's not true. You should have to pay. So, does that make sense? Yeah. All right, guys. So finish out book 1 for Wednesday. I want taco.